For the next few lecture sessions, I want to consider potassium channels. We have already spoken of channels such as sodium channels, calcium channels, chloride channels. We've even spoken of potassium channels before. And again, as the names imply, when they're open, they allow a specific or a set of electrolytes or ions to pass through. Why we want to spend a little more time on potassium channels, because of all of the ion channels, the potassium channels are the most diverse and most complex. There are over 50 types of potassium channels that have been characterized to date. And there's been discovered that over 80 different types of genes code for the various subunits that are put together to create these various potassium channels. Each of these potassium channels have their own kinetics, have their own physical properties in terms of how they open, how they close, what they permit in, what they permit out in terms of flow of potassium. So this is why we need to spend a little more time on potassium channels. Obviously, we're not going through all 50 types of channels, but what I want to do here in the next few lecture blocks is to kind of categorize, in general terms, various types of potassium channels relative to their physical characteristics so that you have at least a broad conceptual framework in which to think about these channels. Before I move on there, though, I need to define a couple of concepts to you. One is rectification. So rectification in the context of cell biology simply means that I am having a flow of ions, and because these ions are charged, hence the definition of an ion, when they flow, I'm moving charge, that means then I am moving the potential of the membrane. So with that in mind, when we say something is inward rectifying, what we're meaning here is that the ions are moving into the cell. If we have outward rectification, that simply means the ions are moving out of the cell. So that's what we mean. So applying that concept to channels, what you'll find in the literature is that some channels are described as inward rectifying channels. What that means is that for that particular channel that's associated with a particular ion, that it is easier for that ion to flow into the cell compared to ions flowing out of the cell through that particular channel. So this brings up another concept, which is it's probably not that useful to think of a channel as just some simple conduit that things flow, where particles flow freely in and out. The nature of a pore, it's complex, and the movement of an electrolyte through a pore, the configuration of the pore can be such that it is easier for an electrolyte or an ion to move into the cell compared to out of the cell. So we're going to be talking about potassium. So, and as you know, potassium, can flow in, or like any other ion, can flow in or out of the cell, depending upon the forces acting upon the potassium. But there are some pores or some channels where potassium has an easier time going in one direction versus the other direction. And it has to do, again, with the characteristics of the pore itself. So I just said we had a wide diversity of potassium channels. So some of these potassium channels, it is easier for the potassium to flow in to the cell from outside, and some of the potassium channels, it's easier to flow the other direction. Now, what direction the potassium will flow is strictly dependent upon the Nernst value and the reversal potential. In other words, you'll recall back the Nernst value is a mathematical equation that allows us to predict what the equilibrium point is in terms of movement of an electrolyte. So we have to distinguish the ease through which a electrolyte, in this case potassium, can move in or out of the cell through a given pore, but that has nothing to do with whether it will or won't. Whether it will or won't has more to do with the forces acting on the potassium. And of course, as we've said before, it's a function of the concentration gradient, and it's a function of the electrical force acting on it. And of course, the Nernst value pulls all those together to come up with what we call the Nernst value, or a reversal potential. So let me elaborate a little bit on that as well. This is kind of a review. Is that if you were to have a cell here, okay, and it has a channel here, and we're just going to make it a potassium channel. And as you know, most of your potassium is inside the cell, and a little bit is outside the cell. So again, just in isolation, and we have a potential of the cell itself here, and suppose the resting membrane potential was minus 70 millivolts. So minus 70 millivolts is resting membrane potential. And so if that's a resting membrane potential, remember that is going to be a function of the chord conductance equation. So what that means is that it is accounting for all the various channels involving the common electrolytes or the ions. So we're talking about chloride, we're talking about sodium, of course we're talking about potassium, etc. So when all of those factors are brought together in the chord conductance, you get a resting membrane potential, because each of those ions are going to have their own Nernst value, or their own reversal potential. And remember, we talked about there's just a tug of war between all of these various Nernst values in terms of what each of these electrolytes are wanting the membrane to be in terms of its potential. And so when you put it all in the mix and you do the weighting that you would do in terms of the chord conductance equation, you come up with a theoretical resting membrane potential. Okay, but let's just pretend that the Nernst value is minus 80 millivolts. Okay, that's kind of close. Minus 80 millivolts for potassium. In other words, that's what potassium wants the membrane potential to be. So what that means is that as long as the membrane is above the Nernst value, or the reversal potential of minus 80, then the net force of the acting on the potassium is it's going to want to move the potassium out to bring it to its Nernst value. Now, I've just said the resting membrane potential is minus 70. Let me put the minus in there. But that's, again, because we have the sodium and the chloride and other ions that are coming into play. But we're just isolating on the potassium. So as long as the membrane potential is above minus 80, then that means the potassium would want to leave if it could. Now, if the membrane potential were below minus 80, maybe it was minus 90 for some reason, then the forces of the action potential, the forces of the on the sodium or on the potassium would have the potassium wanting to move into the cell, because it's wanting to raise it from minus 90 to minus 80. So the direction of the potassium is driven by whether you're above or below the reversal potential. Now, again, I've said this before, but why do they call it reversal potential? Because when a membrane is at a particular ion's reversal potential, what that means is that there's no net movement or no net force acting on it, so you would get no current from that ion if the membrane is sitting at the reversal potential or the Nernst value for that particular ion. But if you go above it, in this case for potassium, then that means potassium is going to leave the cell. If you go below it, that means potassium is going to come into the cell. So that particular minus 80, quote, reversal potential, reversal meaning it's reversing the direction through by which the potassium is going to flow, into the cell out or out of the cell in. Again, why they call it reversal potential. Now, if a resting membrane potential, let's say at minus 70, and the potassium reversal potential or Nernst value is minus 80, typically in physiological systems, you're not going to have too many occasions where the membrane potential would actually be below the potassium reversal potential, because potassium is the kind of the driver in terms of negativity. I mean, maybe some pathological systems or situations might have that to be the case, but typically you're not going to be below the reversal potential for potassium. But if you were theoretically, and you can certainly do this experimentally, then the potassium would be flowing into the cell. Okay. So again, I'm making a distinction between the nature of the channel itself, in terms of how easy it is to go in and out, versus whether it will go in or out given the opportunity, and that's all about the Nernst value. Another thing that we could talk about would be that when we're applying these terms, inward rectifying, outward rectifying, is that many times and we're going to see this in a minute, the inward rectifying actually makes it into the name of the channel. Why? Probably for more historical reasons, but consider the voltage-sensitive potassium channel. The voltage-sensitive sodium channel. You'll recall from the voltage-sensitive sodium channel, sodium can rush in, it doesn't have very much of an opportunity to rush out. So we could say then that the voltage-sensitive sodium channel could be also described as an inward rectifying channel. Why? Because sodium easily goes in, has a very difficult time going back out. But we don't usually call the voltage-sensitive sodium channel inward rectifying sodium channel. It just isn't part of the name, although it would be considered an inward rectifying channel. What we're going to find out in a moment is that we have some inward rectifying potassium channels, and that actually makes it into the name. So I'm saying this because I don't want you to get confused that sometimes the inward rectifying is part of the name, but other times it's not. What does that really mean? Well, nothing other than just historical accident in terms of tradition of calling channels particular names. So don't let that one throw you off. Anyway, if you have to, review, where we talked about this before earlier in your notes. Okay. Again, we spent a lot of time talking about the Nernst value, so go back over it if this is a little fuzzy for you, so you have a clear understanding of what I'm talking about here. All right, so I want to move on and get into these categories of potassium channels. So I'm going to have two buckets, conceptual buckets. And in one bucket, we're going to say that there are a set of potassium channels that are voltage sensitive. What that means, of course, is that the degree of openness or closeness of the potassium channel is purely a function of the potential of the membrane. In other words, it's sensitive to the potential of the membrane, therefore open or close, voltage sensitive. And then we have the other bucket, which is we have potassium channels that are open or closed for other reasons, but really doesn't have anything to do with voltage potential. So we would just call those non-voltage sensitive potassium channels. And I'm going to get to those in another lecture. So for the rest of this lecture, I just want to focus on some categories of voltage sensitive potassium channels. Again, each of these channels are different. They have their own kinetics. They have their own properties in terms of what voltage potential, do they open or close? Again, this is a heterogeneous mix of channels. So I want to focus on the closing moments of this particular block on two. One would be called a transient outward current potassium channel. And again, there are multiple subtypes of channels that fall into this category. And so what we have here is that they will open rapidly in response to depolarization, then they close rapidly. So again, voltage sensitive, so if they're sitting in an excitable membrane, again, an excitable membrane is a membrane that has the ability to have an action potential. If they're depolarized, they open just for a little bit and then they close. So very rapid. You will find if you are studying cardiology, muscle physiology for the cardiac muscle, these channels here play an important role in action potentials for cardiac muscle. So anyway, that's one category called transient outward current. Again, they're called transient because they're pretty quick in terms of opening and closing very rapidly. Okay, so the next one, and this is the last one we'll do in this block here, is going to be called delayed rectifying potassium channels. Again, multiple subtypes of these, and they each have their own name, which I'm not worried about. But these channels here, the delayed rectifying potassium channels, these are actually considered outward rectifying. Even though outward rectifying isn't part of the name, they're called outward rectifying. So what does that mean? Outward rectifying means that when they're open, potassium has theoretically an easier time going out than it does going in. But again, whether it goes out or in is dependent upon the Nernst value and the electrochemical forces acting on potassium. So why are they called delayed? They're called delayed because, we'll do a timeline here. Okay, time here. Okay, so suppose you then have your depolarizing event here. Okay, and time is moving this direction. Some of these channels will open up this amount of time from the depolarization. Some will open up this amount of time, and some will open this amount of time. So again, depending on what type of delayed rectifying potassium channels we're talking about, again, there are many types, but they're all a little delayed, but some are more delayed than others. And so, and again, in some of the names you'll run across, you'll have some that are considered ultra rapid, some that are rapid, and some that are slow. As I keep in, the ones that are ultra rapid are the ones that will open a little bit after the depolarizing event, but they're the fastest of this class. And then you have the ones that are pretty slow. One of the other characteristics of this is that unlike the transient outward current potassium channels, when these channels open, they stay open for a fairly long amount of time. Therefore, they're going to allow more potassium to efflux because they're open for a longer period of time when compared to the transients. You will find these types of channels throughout the body. You'll find them in neurons, kidneys, muscle tissue, and such. Okay, so again, the reason they're called delayed is because there's a delay in terms of when they open, but when they open, they're going to open up for a fair period of time compared to the transient outward currents here. And again, these are called, or could be considered, outward rectifying, as is these transient outward current potassium channels. They're also considered outward rectifying potassium channels. Okay, so that's where we are here, and so we'll go on for some other types of voltage sensitive channels in the next lecture. Okay, so we're involved in talking about the voltage sensitive potassium channels. So I want to go to the next category, which we would call inward rectifying potassium channels. And again, just as a reminder, inward rectifying means that the potassium has an easier time going into the cell than it does leaving the cell. But again, as I said last time, it's rare that a potassium would go in the cell because it's rare for a cell membrane potential to be below the Nernst value or the reversal potential for potassium anyway. So the vast majority of the time, the inward rectifying potassium channels are going to be allowing potassium to leave the cell as opposed to coming into the cell. Many, many subtypes of these, of course, with each having different characteristics. So what I want to do to explain this best is to consider the following graph here. So what we have is we have a membrane potential on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis we have current or amperage or movement of charge. And so the units here are not in amps, but rather just kind of normalized. So we're just going to call this 1 and this -1. And anything that is on the positive means that the potassium is moving out of the cell, and anything in the negative direction means potassium is moving in the cell. So we would say, in this case, potassium into cell, if it's in anywhere between 0 and -1, and then up here, potassium out of cell. So that's going to be indicating the direction of movement and the degree. So if I'm up here, say at 1, that means a lot of potassium is moving out of the cell. If I'm sitting here, there, that means less potassium is moving out of the cell, but still moving out of the cell nonetheless. And the same thing down here. If I'm all the way down here, lots of potassium are moving into the cell. And if I'm here, a little bit of potassium is moving into the cell. Okay, so you have your axes in terms of your y-axis and your x-axis. So what I want to do is draw your attention to the red line. And so what we have here, and I'll just retrace over here. So this guy right here is just showing me a characteristic here. So what it's doing, x-axis is going to be what the potential is in the membrane, and then the y-axis is going to be movement of current, and then the direction of the movement of current, in this case potassium, whether it's leaving the cell or going into the cell. So when you're looking at this red function here, and this red function here is going to be a type of inward rectifying potassium channel. Okay, many, many subtypes. But this would be, again, a trace of one type of inward rectifying potassium channel. Now, if I were to ask you to interpret this graph here, looking again at the red function, and if the question were posed to you, can you identify the reversal potential of the membrane given the information of the red function? You should look at that and you should be able to determine what the reversal potential is in this situation here. And again, remind you what a reversal potential is, or a Nernst value. That is the value, whereas the membrane potential, if it's at that reversal potential, then the net forces of acting on the potassium, in this case, moving it out of the membrane, or out of the cell and into the cell, is the same. So there's no net movement or no net force on that. So therefore, the membrane is at Nernst value, which means there's no net movement of potassium. So in this case here, where, in other words, what I'm saying is, where is current 0? Well, it is 0 right here. So maybe that's minus, I don't know, minus 83 millivolts. But that is the reversal potential. So what that means then, looking at this graph, is that obviously the channel is open at the Nernst value at minus 83, and that if the membrane potential is above the minus 83, as in more positive, then the flow of potassium is going to go out of the cell. And we see this here. So, I mean, this is all, we're on the outside of the cell there. And if the membrane potential is below minus 80, then what that then means is all through down here, okay, that's telling me that the flow of potassium is going into the cell. And again, it kind of makes sense. If I'm sitting at, say, I don't know, say a minus 120, that's pretty negative, right? And again, you're not going to get minus 120 in real biological systems. So that's only in experimental situations where you could do that. But if the membrane were sitting at minus 120, then the membrane wants, or the potassium wants the potential to be minus 83. So that means you're going to have potassium is going to be flowing into the cell, pulling in more positives to counteract this very negative we have here. And because it's minus 120, so more potassium flows in. As more potassium flows in, then it's going to pull the membrane potential to its Nernst value. So that's what this means, and that's what that graph means. So let me undo the shading here. Okay. So what you'll note here is that, again, this is empirically derived. So you're testing the potassium flow as you vary the membrane potential, and you find out that if I go from, and let's just say we're just going to pretend that's minus 83 millivolts as the Nernst value. So if I'm moving in this direction here, that I'm going to have a flow into, you see this right there, and it's pretty robust. I mean, it's getting close to the 1 value or the minus 1 value. But if the membrane potential is above the reversal potential or Nernst value, then note here, this flow, again, is out of the cell, but note the degree of current. You see that there? So it's just a couple clicks above the 0. So I'm not having nearly the current of potassium out of the cell compared to the current of potassium into the cell when I'm below the Nernst value. So the conclusion here is that this particular channel, potassium has a much easier time going into it than it does leaving it. So if it has this profile, then we would talk about this in terms of being an inward rectifying potassium channel. Even though the vast majority of the time, the inward rectifying channels are going to be allowing potassium to flow out, because most of the time the membrane potential is above the Nernst value or the reversal potential. So also note, and this is a characteristic of just this particular type of inward rectifying channel we're talking about, is that you're going to have a flow here at, whatever this is, minus 60 maybe, minus 65. But then as the membrane potential gets less and less and less negative, as in this direction here, by the time you get to the membrane potential being at 0 millivolts, there's no flow of potassium out of the cell at all. So the nature of this membrane, of this potassium channel here, is that as it gets so positive, it just closes down, and so therefore no potassium is leaving the cell. Now the potassium wants to leave the cell when the membrane potential is 0 because it's very far away from the Nernst value. It's just that this particular channel's characteristic is the closer it gets to 0, the tighter it becomes in terms of being more closed. So this channel here, by the time you get to the positive potential, this channel is totally closed. Even though potassium wants to leave, it can't because this channel is closed. So that would be the characteristic of this particular channel. Now I could have, and I'll just go a different example here, go orange. I guess you can maybe see the difference there. Okay, so maybe if I were to pick another inward rectifying potassium channels and did the same little deal here, maybe I would find that the profile would be something like this. Maybe it's down here, so it's inward rectifying, and then maybe it allows more current, but not nearly as much, and then maybe it just kind of stays like that, and then maybe comes down at a later point. Okay, I mean, I'm just made that up, but what I'm saying is you can have different profiles of inward rectifying channels. Again, they're being inward rectifying because they're much easier for potassium to come in than to leave, but you can have varying times of profiles. Maybe this one is this, or maybe this one is this, and then comes down. Again, you can go on and on about the various characteristics of these inward rectifying potassium channels. But again, what makes them inward rectifying is that it's easier for potassium to go in than it is to leave, even though, again, as I said, the vast majority of the time, potassium is flowing out of the cell through these inward rectifying potassium channels. Okay, so that's what that is. All right, so let's move on to another type of potassium channel, which I think is really, really cool. And this would be the M channel. The M channel is interesting in the following way, is that it will respond to depolarization. In other words, if you have a depolarization, it's going to open up, hence because it's, is voltage sensitive, causing potassium to efflux. Why? Because that's where the forces are, because the membrane is above the Nernst value or reversal potential. But what the curious thing about these M channel potassium channels is that they are going to be influenced by the activity of acetylcholine, and it's going to be when acetylcholine binds to a muscarinic receptor. You got the M is a muscarinic receptor, and we know muscarinic receptor is a metabotropic receptor. It's not an ion channel in and of itself. So any potassium that flows through an M potassium channel is called the M current. So this is what I want to do because I think this is really cool in terms of how these things work. So let's go back and imagine that we have a neuron or a excitable cell membrane on a neuron. And so I'm just going to draw the membrane here. And again, suppose this may be sitting at its standard 70 millivolts. And we're going to say that this is an excitable membrane, which means it's going to have the voltage channels or the voltage sensitive channels for sodium and for potassium and such, like what we talked about when we talked about action potentials earlier. So again, we could have maybe a voltage sensitive sodium channel here. Of course, you got a lot of sodium out here and a little bit of sodium in here, got a lot of potassium in here, a little bit of potassium outside. So we have a voltage sensitive, and then we have a, let's go green here, and we'll have this as my potassium channel. Now these voltage sensitive potassium channels that are, that we've talked about earlier in terms of having to do with the action potential, these are going to fall in the category of delayed rectifying potassium channels. Okay, delayed rectifying, it was a little bit of delay before they open after depolarization, but how long they stay open, again, depends upon what subtype of delayed rectifying potassium channels there are. So this would be, again, my potassium channel. It's going to be a delayed rectifying channel. I'm just going to make this up here. All right. So as you recall from the sequence of what you learned from action potentials, I'm going to have some type of depolarizing event. And we'll go back to here, extend this here, and just suppose that I have a glutamate receptor here. Okay, so this would be a glutamate receptor, and then I've got glutamate floating around. And so the glutamate binds, then that's going to allow, again, sodium to come in. That is going to depolarize the membrane, which will then activate the voltage-sensitive sodium channels. They're going to open up, so I'm going to have sodium coming in here. And then also a little bit of delay, I'm going to have my voltage-sensitive potassium channels. We now know these are delayed rectifier channels, and they're going to allow potassium out. And that will then create our classic action potential. Okay, it's going to go up. Well, let me redraw that again, because what we have here is going to go up quickly, and it comes down quickly. You got a little bit of a hyperpolarization, then it resolves itself, and then it's ready for another round. Because again, these potassium channels, these delayed rectifier potassium channels, they'll open up and stay a little longer open, but then they close down fairly rapidly, but they stay a certain amount of, they certainly are open up longer than the voltage-sensitive sodium channels. So this happens very quickly, and so if you have this situation here where you can have a next action potential pretty rapidly after that, and as I've said in other contexts, some neurons can have action potentials up to 1,000 action potentials a second, so that gives you an idea how quickly this thing can resolve itself in terms of opening and closing of channels. So this is normally what you would look at. Now, let's go ahead and put in, suppose that this is one of these neurons that has M channels, potassium M channels in there. So let's go brown here. So now I have an M channel. There's an M channel here. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and put in a muscarinic receptor. I'm just going to call that an M1, just making that up. And that I might have some acetylcholine around somewhere, but I'm not going to worry about the acetylcholine right now. So let's just say now I have this membrane, and I have my usual group of voltage-sensitive channels, again, voltage-sensitive sodiums, voltage-sensitive potassiums here. But this membrane here also has M channels. So this is what's going to happen. These M channels, they're going to open up when you have a depolarization, and they stay open a really long time. So what would that mean for this particular neuronal excitable membrane? So you have some glutamate comes along, binds, then you have the opening of the voltage-sensitive sodium channels, you have the opening of the delayed rectifying potassium channels, they're going to close. But I also have some M channels, and potassium is leaving there as well, and they stay open a fairly lengthy amount of time. So what does that mean? That then means that I'm going to have an action potential that looks like this. It's going to be depolarizing, coming in, hyperpolarizing, and then stays hyperpolarized until these M channels finally close. Okay, this would deep hyperpolarization would be because of these M channels that happen to be there. Now again, many neurons don't have M channels, but some do. And so if I have an excitable membrane in a neuron that has M channels, then what this means is that I can't have a bunch of rapid action potentials. Because as soon as I have one action potential, those M channels take their own sweet time of closing back up. So as long as they're open, potassium is flowing, which means I can't have another action potential until the M channels finally close. So the characteristic of this particular excitable membrane is that it can depolarize, but it's not going to depolarize in rapid succession because those M channels are keeping that from happening. And there are some neurons that's how they work. But here's the super cool stuff. And that is, if you have, again, I'm just making it up, supposing the excitatory neurotransmitter is glutamate. So I'm getting glutamate on this neuron, but everything else being equal, it's good for an action potential, and then it's got to wait for another action potential for a fair amount of time because of the M channels. But suppose on this neuron I also have some muscarinic receptors here. And suppose this particular neuron, in addition to getting glutamate put on it, it's also having acetylcholine being put on it. And then the acetylcholine will bind to that M1 receptor. And when it binds, I'm going to say G proteins happen. There you go. In other words, I'm going to have this cascade of events. And I've got these G proteins and subunits and such. Again, see cell biology for that. But the end result is that when acetylcholine binds to an M1 receptor, I'm going to have a cascade of events, and it's going to end up causing one of these subunit G proteins to bind the M potassium channels. And when it binds the M potassium channels, those channels close. And as long as these G proteins or these subunit G proteins are locked onto the M channel, it keeps the M channels from opening up. Well, if that's the case, and then if I have simultaneous input into this neuron, both glutamate and acetylcholine at the same time, that acetylcholine is going to shut down the M channel potassium channels because of second messenger systems and G proteins and such. That then allows the glutamate input of this neuron to be such that now it can have rapid action potentials. Why? Because the M channels are being inhibited. Why? Because the neuron is receiving acetylcholine binding to a muscarinic receptor, affecting the M channels. So I can actually change the characteristic of the neuronal pattern here by having acetylcholine alter the potassium channels, allowing then a rapid succession of action potentials where normally I couldn't get that because the M channels would be disallowing that rapidity of firing because they open up and they're very slow to slow to close down, therefore keeping the membrane hyperpolarized for a greater length of time. So the activity of the acetylcholine basically shortens up this hyperpolarization phase, allowing a more rapid succession of action potentials. So this is a really good example to show you the complex interaction of all of these channels and all of these receptors and how they can play off each other. Because as we go through these, and I'm showing you these various channels, I don't want you to walk away with the impression that all excitable membranes, whether it's cardiac muscle or skeletal muscle or neurons or axons or whatever else, that I want to leave you with the impression that all of these various subtypes of channels are in all of these excitable neurons. They're not. So each neuron or cardiac muscle or skeletal muscle or whatever, what might have their own subset of these channels. And so what types of channels are present and to what degree these channels are present in terms of numbers is going to then define the nature of that membrane in terms of how it behaves during a stimulatory effect. And so this is kind of a really cool example of how the interplay can happen. Okay, so that's a wrap for the voltage-sensitive channels. Again, my big point here is that there are multiple general types of voltage-sensitive potassium channels, and that within those general types of voltage-sensitive potassium channels, there are subtypes that all have different kinds of characteristics. Oh, one thing I forgot to say, and I need to get this now, as I never did talk about this line up here. Okay, so let me revisit that. Now, closing this and that one too quickly. Okay, that line up there, it represents your regular voltage-sensitive potassium channel. Okay? So what is that line telling you? What that is telling you here is that if the membrane is going, in this case here, it's going to be whatever that, minus 50 maybe? Okay, let's just say this is minus 50 millivolts here. Okay, so anything below minus 50, I'm not having a potassium current. Because the membrane is closed, this particular channel is closed. This voltage-sensitive potassium channel is closed. And so it happens to open with this particular one at, say, minus 50, and then the farther up I go towards the zero, and then passed on into the positive voltage potential region of the membrane, I'm going to have more and more potassium flowing out of the cell, because it's way up here, say, at 1. So you'll note here that the only direction that potassium flows through this particular channel is out. So this would be an outward rectifying channel. Potassium can't flow into the cell with this channel. But even if it could, it still would be outward rectifying because the flow out of the cell is much more robust in terms of current than it would be into the cell. But in this case, it's not in the cell at all because the channel is closed at minus 50 millivolts. Now, another sneaky little question here would be if I were to have you look at that green profile there and say, okay, can you look at that and tell me what the reversal potential is for the membrane? And the answer is you can't tell. I can't look at this green profile here and tell where the reversal potential is because at minus 50, that channel is closed. So it doesn't even give the opportunity for potassium to come into the cell. So the answer to that question is cannot be determined. Now, you could have an outward rectifying potassium channel that may be able to do that. And let me just I'm going to make something up here, and I'll go pink here. Suppose I were to draw this. Suppose I had, and I'll clean this up a little bit here. Okay, suppose that I had a channel and it showed this. Suppose it was like there, and then something like that. Okay, maybe like that. Okay, so I'm looking at that, and again, I'm noting here, now I have this channel. It happens to be open at the reversal potential, and I can see potassium flowing into the cell right here. But note, it's not flowing into the cell nearly to the degree of current as up here is. So this would still be an outward rectifying potassium channel, but this channel happens to be open at the reversal potential. Okay, so again, general point, all of these channels have different profiles, so they're going to be all over the map. But the take-home point is whether it's outward rectifying, inward rectifying, is going to be how much current, how hard is it for potassium to go in versus going out. Okay, so that's a wrap for this, and we'll start taking a look at the non-voltage sensitive potassium channels in the next block. Last time we spoke of voltage-sensitive potassium channels and went through the various versions of those, categories and such. Now I want to move to another category of potassium channels, and these are going to be considered non-voltage sensitive potassium channels. And again, what that means, obviously, is that the state of openness or closedness of the potassium channel is not influenced by the change in the voltage potential of the membrane. Now, we're going to see an exception to that a little later on, but for right now, let's just assume that the voltage potential doesn't matter with this new type or this different type of potassium channels. So, under the category of non-voltage sensitive potassium channels, we have, first of all, what we call a tandem pore domain potassium channel, also known as a two-pore domain potassium channel. I have spoken of these before in other lectures, but I didn't call them that name. What I refer to them as was simply leak channels. And as you'll recall, the leak channels are the potassium channels that greatly influence the resting membrane potential of cells or of membranes themselves. And if you'll recall, that's driven by the core conductance equation, where you take the permeability of a cell membrane relative to the electrolytes that are in the area. Again, typically we're talking about chloride, calcium, potassium, sodium, and we assign a percentage or a weight relative to each other. So we take the sum of the conductance, which again could be viewed as a type of permeability, and each of these electrolytes or ions has its own Nernst value, but the actual resting membrane potential, though, is a function of which, in terms of the cell membrane, it is more permeable or has a greater conductance to one ion versus another ion. And what we've just talked about earlier was that the resting membrane potential, or the membrane itself, is way more permeable to potassium relative to the other ions. Therefore, it gets the greatest weight. And of course, you plug that into the core conductance, and out will pop a theoretical resting membrane potential. Well, the thing that makes the cell membrane so permeable to potassium is because it has many of these leak channels. Now, one point of possible confusion that I want to make sure we're clear on, and that is, even though you have potassium will pass through, will efflux through these leak channels, the degree of permeability of a leak channel is way, way less than the degree of permeability of the voltage-sensitive potassium channels we spoke of earlier. So when one of those voltage-sensitive potassium channels open up, you have much more potassium flowing through per unit time, much significant greater current than you would potassium passing through these leak channels. Hence, that's why they call them leak channels, because they just slowly kind of leak out. But over time, it's, again, has a great influence in terms of the theoretical resting membrane potential. Now, one of the things that possibly could be confusing is this term here, two-pore domain. Not a particularly useful name, because if you looked at the name, you would think, well, this channel must have two pores, and it doesn't. It has one pore. All these potassium channels have one pore. The reason they call it a two-pore domain, it has to do with how the pore is constructed with the various subunits that make up the channel, and that's just not something I will go into right now because it's just, I don't find it particularly useful. So just understand that when you hear the term two-pore domain potassium channel, it only has one pore. If I'm going to call it something other than leak channels, probably my preferred name would just be to call it a tandem pore potassium channel, domain potassium channel. Another thing we want to be aware of is that these, first of all, there are different types, different varieties or subtypes of these leak channels, so they're not all the same. But the other thing we want to be aware of is that these channels are not static. They're non-gated. In other words, they don't have a gate. To have a gate means you can close and open. So these are non-gated channels, but at the same, so they're always open to some degree. But the degree of openness, the degree of permeability, or the degree of conductance through these leak channels can vary. In other words, you can have some cellular processes that makes these leak channels more permeable to potassium, and some cellular processes that makes these channels less permeable to potassium. So you do have some modulation, of course, if I'm varying the conductance or the permeability of these leak channels by various cellular processes, then I am also impacting the resting membrane potential, because now I have to recalculate the core conductance equation. So what are some of the things that can influence the degree of openness or closeness of these non-gated leak channels? One would be oxygen tension. So if oxygen is high or if oxygen is low, and of course that's going to be tied to oxygen delivery or metabolic rate or some combination of, that can influence the permeability of these potassium leak channels, again, in turn influencing the resting membrane potential. pH can influence the degree of permeability of these leak channels. G protein activity can influence the degree of permeability of these channels. Phosphorylation or dephosphorylation, mechanical stretch, alteration in the lipids associated with the channel itself. All of these things can impact the degree of permeability of these leak channels, thereby impacting the resting membrane potential. You also have an array of drugs or pharmacological compounds that can interact with these leak channels, changing their nature as well. And again, just to emphasize, these are non-gated, and they're non-gated meaning they don't open and close. They're always open, but certain things within the microenvironment can influence the degree of openness or closeness. These leak channels are found throughout the body. Many, many, many cells, most cells have some degree of these potassium leak channels in them. Okay, so that's that category, non-voltage sensitive potassium channels, and these are non-gated. Now let's go to another class of potassium channels, and these would be ligand-gated channels, and as the name implies, the state of the channel is determined by interaction of a ligand. Now again, note the word gated. So gated means it has the ability to close. You can close the gate. And the opening and closing of the gate is contingent upon the association of a ligand. And then, of course, as you know, a ligand is anything that can bind to another molecule, and can bind or unbind. In some measure, we could also say that the G protein activity or phosphorylation, dephosphorylation, those are ligands, and so they can bind to these leak channels and influence them, but they're non-gated, so they wouldn't fall in that category of gated, ligand-gated channels. What I'm going to do is go through 3 well-known, well-characterized channels that fall in this category. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the big ones as just kind of examples. So the first thing I want to talk about is going to be the acetylcholine potassium channel. And again, the name implies these channels are sensitive to the level of acetylcholine. Of course, we know acetylcholine is going to be binding to, 2 types of receptors. You have the nicotinic receptors and you have the muscarinic receptors. I'm sure we've talked about that before. You already know that. So in this case here, what we're talking about is acetylcholine binding to a muscarinic receptor, and in particular, the M2 muscarinic receptor. You may recall from earlier discussions, the muscarinic receptors, you got multiple types, M1, M2 through M5. Maybe there are more, don't know, but there are a lot of different subtypes. So as far as the acetylcholine receptor is concerned, we're talking about the M2, and that is the one that can impact a potassium channel. So what you have here, and the cartoon pretty much lays it out for you, and that is you have acetylcholine binding to an M2, and that is going to effect a cascade of events involving G proteins, as we see here, and one of some of the G protein subunits then will bind to a potassium channel, and when it binds to the potassium channel, it will cause that potassium channel to open up, allowing then efflux of potassium through it. So what we have here then is a neurotransmitter binding to a receptor, and through cellular processes will influence another channel, in this case, this type of potassium channel that is sensitive to the presence of acetylcholine. Now, the acetylcholine doesn't bind to this receptor here, or channel. It's binding to this receptor here, and through cellular processes will control that channel there. So this is a little different than a typical scenario that you would think about. If you'll recall, in earlier conversations, we had ionotropic channels, and the ionotropic channel is where, again, a neurotransmitter will bind to it and will cause it to open or close. So we have classic ionotropic receptors for sodium, for calcium, and for chloride. You remember chloride, you have GABA. So, GABA A type of receptors are chloride channels. GABA binds to it, it opens up. So I'm not aware of any potassium channel that is a classic ionotropic channel. In other words, I'm not aware of any potassium channel that is exclusive to potassium, in terms of allowing just potassium to go through, where a neurotransmitter will bind to that channel and open or close a potassium channel. I can think of them for the other ions, but not for potassium. So the potassium, if we're talking about a neurotransmitter influencing a potassium channel, it's going to be via some type of metabotropic receptor. In the case of acetylcholine, it's going to be the M2 receptor. Now, these channels can be referred to sometimes in literature as inward rectifier channels. Again, as we spoke of earlier, inward rectifying, outward rectifying, that's just simply descriptors to describe how easily potassium flows in or out of the cell through that particular channel. Again, it can be confusing because this is not to be confused with the, quote, inward rectifying voltage sensitive channels. Those are two different types of channels. Again, the name's confusing. I understand that. But inward rectifying, outward rectifying is just an adjective type of phrase that describes how easily potassium can flow in and out. And of course, as we said many times before, whether the potassium is going to efflux or influx through that channel is strictly a function of the Nernst value or the reversal potential and the forces acting on the potassium. So hard to imagine in any situation here, even though it's inward rectifying or it's an inward rectifier channel, the potassium actually would flow into the cell or go through it this way, simply because the membrane potential is almost never below the Nernst value. So even though we consider it an inward rectifier, potassium is effluxing when acetylcholine binds to this receptor. This type of situation here, these potassium acetylcholine type of channels, again found throughout the body. You'll recall the parasympathetic system, just to give you an example. Okay, and you've got a neuron here going to be going to a parasympathetic ganglia. Of course, acetylcholine is binding to that, and it's going to bind to nicotinic receptors, and it also can bind to M1 receptors here, and then it's going to be releasing acetylcholine here, and then you have your effector organ. And what the acetylcholine does here at the end point is strictly a function of what kind of receptors are on that organ. And so all I'm saying is that if you have these M2 receptors in this particular organ, then what that means is it's going to be causing some type of change in the potassium channels, because you're also likely going to have this type of potassium KACH there in the same membrane, and of course that's going to be influencing that. I'm not saying that's the only thing acetylcholine does, because again it just depends upon what receptor is sitting at the end of that particular synapse. Okay, kind of a side note to wrap this up, and that is that with potassium channels that are ligand gated, potassium channels where neurotransmitters can influence them through cellular processes. The acetylcholine is not the only neurotransmitter that does this. Many transmitters can influence potassium channels. Whether we're talking about serotonin or dopamine or GABA, some of the neuropeptides can influence potassium channels. We're talking opioids would be an example of that. And they can, again, influence the resting membrane potential of a membrane when they interact. Just to get more specific here, just show a different example. Imagine you have a receptor here, and this is a serotonin receptor, and so I'm having serotonin here. Binding to that, there are actually potassium channels that are sensitive to this process here, and so this would be a potassium channel there. And again, it's not called serotonin potassium channels. It has some other funky name I'm not going to worry about. I'm just making an example here. But when serotonin binds to this receptor here, you have cellular processes go on, and this actually will end up phosphorylating this channel here. When it phosphorylates it, that is going to open the channel up and then allow potassium to efflux. So here's an example where we're talking about phosphorylation versus non-phosphorylation. Over here, we're talking about interaction of G proteins serving as the ligand for these channels here. So I could go on and on about all the various type of neurotransmitters that can influence potassium channels. Again, so there are many examples of this. So I'm just kind of showing you this channel here as an example of how that would work. One last point. The M2 is one of the major receptors that can influence these types of potassium channels that are sensitive to the presence of acetylcholine. I'm not wanting to imply that it is exclusively M2. There could be other muscarinic receptors that could also influence these potassium acetylcholine channels as well. So again, as everything else, it's more complicated than what I'm showing you here. But again, my major point here and the theme that I'm trying to hit here is that you have a class of potassium channels that are sensitive to acetylcholine, but sensitive to acetylcholine through the interaction of an acetylcholine neurotransmitter binding to a muscarinic receptor, and then through cellular processes will lead to the opening of that potassium channel, thereby influencing the cell membrane's behavior. Okay, so we'll pick up on some of these other channels in the next block. Okay, the last two general type of potassium channels that are not technically called voltage sensitive is going to be ATP sensitive potassium channels, and the next is going to be calcium sensitive potassium channels. So let's talk about the ATP sensitive potassium channels. Again, there are multiple subtypes of these. So these types of potassium channels are sensitive, as the name implies, sensitive to the level of ATP. So here's a key point here. The presence of ATP will inhibit these channels. So as long as I have a normal amount of ATP, these channels are going to be closed. What that also means is that if I have an environment where I have abnormally low ATP, which many times would indicate this as a cell that is stressed because of lack of oxygen or some other reason, then the ATP goes down. That then is going to cause these potassium channels to begin to open, and when they begin to open, you're going to have potassium effluxing out of the cell, which is going to cause the cell membrane to be more negative. So this is going to cause, again, an efflux of potassium. And of course, as long as the membrane is above the Nernst value, it's going to be flowing out. These are considered inward rectifying channels. Even though it doesn't have inward rectifying in the name, if you were to go through and do the profile and characterize this like we did up here, it's going to show that it's much easier for potassium to go in than it is to leave. But regardless, the way these things function is the potassium is going to be leaving the cell, hyperpolarizing the membrane. Again, each of these have different characteristics. In some tissues, this is actually a safety thing. And if you go and look at heart or something like that, where you have a diminished ability of oxygen and the ATP levels are lower, and so these channels begin to open up. And when they open up, it makes it harder for the heart to have an action potential, and will slow the heart rate down, can influence that. And that's actually a protective measure because you don't want the heart to have a metabolic rate that is going beyond the oxygen supply. So that's just kind of a quick example of how that would work. So anyway, this is pretty cool. These channels are found throughout the body. You can find them in kidney, in neurons, again, muscle tissue and such. One of these channels is actually named ROMK, called renal outer medullary potassium channels. And obviously, you're going to find these in kidneys. So these are a major potassium channel in the kidneys. They play a key role in the kidney, again, for potassium secretion, which is what happens. The word secretion in the kidney means you're taking something from the body and putting it into the urine so that you can then eliminate it from your body. So your part of the role of your kidneys is to eliminate all that excess potassium that you eat. Going to put it into the urine, and so it literally will secrete it, or just actually actively push it into the urine. So that's one of the things it does. Again, there are many other types of potassium channels in the kidney, of course, but this ROMK is a type of ATP-sensitive potassium channels. Okay, last one is going to be the calcium-sensitive potassium channels. You can look at the name and, again, say what's going on here. This one's kind of interesting in the sense of it kind of blurs the traditional lines of categories. So you have two general categories of calcium-sensitive potassium channels. You have potassium channels that are activated by the presence of calcium, and that's one. So let's say potassium channels that are activated by the presence of calcium. The other is going to be those that can, this is two, those that can be activated by either a change in membrane potential or the presence of calcium. So here, this one bends the two-bucket thing of is it voltage sensitive or non-voltage sensitive. Well, this one's kind of, it can go either way. So this one is voltage sensitive, but also ligand sensitive as well. So this one's kind of a little harder one to categorize. But you have those as well. So two, and again, there are subtypes of each of these two categories. The former are named SK channels, and these are as in small channels, or small potassium. Small potassium means that it is just allows a little bit of potassium to go through. Okay, so again, they can flow through when they're stimulated by calcium, but not a large current flows through here. And again, just to draw you a cartoon, I don't think you really need this, but if I were to have a potassium channel here, and it is maybe closed, but then if I have an environment of elevated calcium, the calcium can bind to it, which then opens it up and again allows potassium to flow out. Again, so you have a small current through the calcium-sensitive potassium channels, and you would call those SK channels. Again, many subtypes of SK channels. Then you have the second type of channel, which can either open when calcium binds to it, or when you have a depolarizing event in the membrane itself. These are also called BK, as in big potassium. So called big potassium because they're really, really, really good at opening up and allowing lots and lots of potassium to efflux out of the cell. So those are called the BK channels. They'll, again, either respond to voltage potential change or calcium binding to it. Again, as I said, multiple types of SK and BK channels. Your BK and SK channels are found throughout the body. You have them in neurons, kidneys, smooth muscles, etc. While I'm on the subject of calcium-sensitive channels, in this case potassium, I did want to just remind you that calcium can also influence voltage-sensitive sodium channels. This is kind of a side detour, but and I've mentioned this before, but I just want to make sure you have this concept down. Is that calcium can influence many receptors, and or channels. Okay, again, calcium is a player in cell processes, as you all know. Okay, an example would be voltage-sensitive sodium channels. So what happens with voltage-sensitive sodium channels is that in the presence of calcium, these channels are actually inhibited. Now, I don't mean inhibited as being shut down, but inhibited as they're not as easily opened up. So what happens then is that if I have hypercalcemia, in other words, calcium is really, really high, that is going to inhibit these voltage-sensitive sodium channels, make them just ever so slightly more difficult to open up. And the patient then will have fatigue, cognitive issues. They're going to feel like they're in a funk, muscle weakness. Okay, why? Because again, these voltage-sensitive sodium channels have a little bit more difficult time opening up because of higher than normal level of calcium, and you get these types of effects. This would be classic for someone who has hyperparathyroidism. Okay, as you may have learned before, but if you have hyperparathyroidism, you have too much PTH, and PTH is a hormone that is going to encourage your body to retain calcium. So your calcium levels are going to go up if you have too much parathyroid hormone. And if you have that, then you have elevated levels of calcium. And then the classic, again, profile for someone who is struggling with too much parathyroid hormone or hyperparathyroidism is going to be fatigue, cognitive issues, and muscle weakness. And that's one of the reasons why. So if you go the other way, though, if you have hypocalcemia, which means your calcium level is abnormally low, that is going to disinhibit the voltage-sensitive sodium channel. So now all of a sudden the voltage-sensitive sodium channel is more active. Abnormally active. So what you have here, this is an important concept, what you have here is you have a baseline level of calcium in the cells. So you always have a baseline level of calcium influencing voltage-sensitive sodium channels, always. So whatever your degree of sensitivity of your voltage-sensitive sodium channels, that's because of the presence of calcium. So this puts me in a situation now where I can dial it up or dial it down. So if I dial it up, more calcium interacts, making it less active, the voltage-sensitive sodium channels. But if calcium levels drop, it makes the voltage-sensitive sodium channels a little more sensitive, so they're more inclined to open up, causing action potentials. So if someone has then hypocalcemia, I think you can kind of guess what their problem is going to be. Well, they're going to have muscle spasms. Why? Because they're just too sensitive. They're going to have cramps. Okay, could lead to tetanus. Again, why? Because you have hypersensitivity of these voltage-sensitive sodium channels because my calcium level interaction is less, kind of taking the brakes off of these voltage-sensitive sodium channels, making them too active. And then also in some cases, abnormally low levels of calcium, hypocalcemia, could lead to seizures. So obviously is a neuronal event. Okay. All right, again, a little side junket there just to, to highlight that calcium influences many different types of channels. And again, I just want to use an example of voltage-sensitive sodium. But anyway, back to calcium also influencing potassium channels as well. So my closing comment here is that many potassium channels, voltage-dependent, ligand-gated, can be phosphorylated, dephosphorylated, interact with G proteins and such, which can then affect their function. Many neurotransmitters, neuropeptides, which would include opioids, or influence of other neurotransmitters, can influence the function of many ion channels, including potassium channels through these various cellular processes. So one of the things I'm hoping you walk away with is understanding what a complex weave all of this is. You have all the variety of channels, and then overlaid on the variety of channels, they can influence each other. The receptors can influence the channels and such. And then you have all these other cellular second messenger systems that can alter the functioning of all these various channels and such. So it gets insanely complicated, but I'm hoping you can appreciate the beauty of all this interaction that makes us to be physiologically normal. Okay, so that's a wrap on potassium channels. And again, my point was I was being very general in terms of just thinking in terms of just general categories of how these things operate in the cell. Okay, we'll see you next time.